Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the POK Podcast. For today's discussion, we're going to be looking at breed-specific legislation, and in particular, we're going to be looking at the stigma surrounding pit bulls. I'm sure many of you have heard about the stigma against pit bulls, and if you look up pit bulls on Google, one of the first things you'll find is a story about how they attacked somebody, they hurt a child, or hurt a full-grown adult, and there are websites all over the internet right now that are specifically dedicated to criminalizing pit bulls. And what we want to look at today is to look at the merit of those websites, to see where the stigma came from, if there's any truth to it behind the claims against pit bulls, and if breed-specific legislation actually works in regards to preventing dog bites.
Right. So let's start with a brief history. Pit bulls were originally bred from Old English bulldogs. That is a breed that still exists today. But pit bulls diverted from them back around the 1800s. And originally, pit bulls were used for a blood sport called bull baiting, where the dog and a bull would be put into a pit, and the bull would be chained up, and the dog was meant to attack and kill the bull. And this was a form of entertainment. Well, in 1835, blood spurts were deemed illegal in the UK. And so that is what spawned the start of dogfighting, because it was much easier to hide that activity from authorities than it was to hide bull baiting from authorities. So eventually, the breed made its way to America, where at first it was not used for any kind of blood sport or negativity. They were used for farming, for protection from predators, for watching over children. They were known as nanny dogs for a period of time. And they provided companionship because of their tendency to be really loyal to their owners. And so during this time, there was a very positive perspective of pit bulls, and they were kind of the unofficial mascot of America for a little while. And even during World War I and World War II, there were pit bulls that were a part of the military.
And they showed up in advertising too for the military as well.
So they were highly celebrated as America's nanny dog for a little while. Unfortunately, though, from the 60s into the 80s, it's not super clear. There was a big resurgence of dogfighting that happened in America. These dogs were regularly abused and altered to make them look more aggressive. So the cropped ears, giving them physical strength training to make them more muscular and lean. Obviously, we've all heard of Michael Vick and the things that he did in regards to dogfighting. And so this is what really spawned the negative persona surrounding pit bulls. And they were also bred outside of the American Kennel Club, so it's not like they were creating a purebred line. These were definitely, I don't want to call them designer dogs, but that's pretty much what they were. They were designing their perfect fighting dogs at the time. However, it wasn't until mid to late 1980s when BSL laws started to come out in full force. The first one was in 1980 in Florida, but in 1987, Time magazine published an article called "The Pitbull Friend and Killer." The front of the magazine had a very aggressive, mean-looking pit bull on it, and the statistics used were heavily painting this breed in a very negative light. There wasn't a whole lot of, the other side of the argument is, no, it was a very condemning piece of literature.
Yeah, and like Jordan said, there's a little bit of dispute as to when the negative media attention towards pit bulls started.
Right.
Between the 1960s and the 1980s, there was a pit bull attack that ended up killing, I think it was a child in Florida sometime around the 1960s, and that's kind of when it became known in the media about the potential for lethal dog bites with pit bulls. But it should be really noted that the persona that pit bulls have been given through the media has been attributed to other dogs in the past as well. So it hasn't just been pit bulls this whole time. There's been other dogs that have received the same kind of treatment. Most popularly was the bloodhounds. and the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were vilified the same way that pit bulls are today. For those of you who do not know, bloodhounds were used to chase down slaves.
Hunt down escaped slaves.
And that's mostly where they got their reputation from. But not just them. Bloodhounds were just one of many.
Yep.
But German Shepherds got a similar treatment. Rottweilers got a similar treatment. Dobermans got a similar treatment. Huskies got a similar treatment at one point.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, with all these other stigmas that have been perpetuated around these specific breeds, they all seem to die out after a while.
Right.
But for whatever reason, the pit bull stigma has stuck around. And it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's not. There's not a whole lot of difference, it doesn't seem, between what's been happening with these breeds. But for whatever reason, the media has been driving a very strong stigma that's lasted and stuck up until today.
Yeah, and I think part of the contributing factor to the stigma is pit bulls are definitely a status symbol for certain people. Certain people have pit bulls and they love them and they think they're wonderful and they are fat babies. But there are still also other people that crop their ears and beef them up and use them as this I'm big and powerful status symbol, which is not something that we typically see with German Shepherds or Dobermans or Rottweilers.
Yeah, and it should be kind of noted, though, that maybe one of the differing circumstances between the stigmas of other dogs and with pit bulls is the availability of the media to some extent. So I'm thinking about social media, I'm thinking about the internet and how easily those stories have been perpetuated and spread. But then also just the physique of a pit bull in itself, right? So pit bulls are very strong dogs. They're one of the strongest dogs in the world. And when you look at a bloodhound versus, a husky, et cetera, et cetera.
And to be clear, we're not saying that they have the strongest bite force, because I know somebody out there is going to be like, well, as a matter of fact, no, I know that they don't have the strongest bite force. But as far as muscle mass goes, they're of the strongest dogs.
Yeah, they're very athletic dogs.
They're insanely athletic dogs.
So it would make sense that at least that their physique might have helped perpetuate this thing.
Exactly.
To some extent.
Yeah.
But what we'll end up talking about a little bit later is it does seem that this media bias, and we'll talk a bit more about how that exactly presents itself, but it has driven a lot of the legislation around breed-specific legislation. Right. Most of most states actually have a form of breed-specific legislation, which we should also mention. And most of these states get their information about pit bulls directly from the media. And that will be a little bit concerning when we look at how just inaccurate and how many times the media gets it wrong.
Well, speaking about inaccuracies, one of the biggest, and for me, the first problem is that, so pit bull is not a breed recognized by the AKC. It is recognized by the CKC. Yes.
So what is the CKC?
So AKC is the American Kennel Club. It's the biggest, it's like a registry for dog breeds. So if you have a purebred Pomeranian, let's say, and both of their parents were AKC registered, it's like a verification that the dog is that specific breed. It came from this specific lineage. They're also responsible for the dog shows every year. And then you have the CKC and the UKC. So the Continental Kennel Club and the UKC is the United Kennel Club. The CKC recognizes the American Pit Bull Terrier as a breed, but the AKC does not. And so what ends up happening is between backyard breeders and dogs, just getting out and having puppies and that kind of thing, there ends up being a lot of dogs in shelters that are just written up as pit mix when there is little to no evidence to suggest that they are a pit mix, other than maybe the wide set bit of their jaw or the way their ears are, or those kind of details. But
so just to kind of maybe summarize that a little bit, is that there's not even a consensus between dog experts as to what a pit bull actually, what that breed is. Right. Because it's more of a mix between several other dogs. So
pit bulls are a mixed breed of other dogs.
Yeah, and so what's most commonly used to identify pit bulls, particularly in the media, is the way they look. Right. So the big heads, the really wide jaws,
wide stance, very muscular, big chest.
And there are a lot of other dog breeds that have those characteristics.
English Bulldogs. They have those same characteristics.
Boxers are another dog type that is often mistaken to be a pit bull.
Mastiff mix are also mistaken. Cane Corso mixes are mistaken as pit bulls. So there's a list of breeds that if they're mixed with maybe a lab, now it looks like a pit bull, that's a pit bull. And in some places, because that dog looks like a pit bull, it gets euthanized in a shelter. No testing, no checking. It's like, no, well, bye.
Yeah, and an interesting study that was conducted by the American Veterinary Medical Association. It's actually a study that's cited quite often by anti-BSL groups.
Mm-hmm.
And what they ended up finding was that there was a really large discrepancy between the breed of dog that a media would report on versus when animal control showed up and identified the dog.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found is that the media 40% of the time got the breed of the dog wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a freakish stat when you think about it, when you also look at the prevalence of how often negative stories are reported on pit bulls, because the name of the dog breed is mentioned in those stories. And an interesting little fact.
It's typically in the headline.
Yeah, an interesting fact to kind of back that up is when incidents involve other breeds of dogs, whatever that breed of dog is, 9 times out of 10, that breed name is not mentioned. Most of the time, the only time the breed is mentioned is when it involves a pit bull, we'll say, looking dog.
Right.
When it looks like a pit bull. And so to add further confusion, there's a big problem with trying to find accurate statistics about the lethality of pit bulls or any other dog breed for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually a big struggle of mine when I was kind of doing research on this particular podcast, was that I could not find an unbiased source that reported on dog bites by breed.
Exactly.
And I thought that was kind of interesting. We'll reveal a little bit later why that might have been the case. But this is important when you look at these specific websites that are dedicated towards criminalizing pit bulls.
Right.
If you look up dog bites in Google, one of the first websites that you will come across is dogbites.org. And it looks like a very, well done, well thought out, clearly has a bunch of research, attached to it. And what you'll end up finding if you look a little bit deeper is that the website is deeply rooted in anti-pit bull bias.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the dogs that they identify as pit bulls and identify as being lethal dog bites are in fact either unknown breeds or mixed breeds or not even a pit bull at all. They classify boxers as being pit bulls into their statistic about dog bite fatalities.
Mm-hmm.
And they are huge proponents of breed-specific legislation. And if you look even deeper than just what's on the surface of the website, if you look at the woman who actually created the website, it's based off of a negative personal experience. If I recall correctly, she was bitten.
There was some incident in her life.
Yeah, she was bitten at one point and basically rededicated her entire life towards making sure that pit bulls no longer exist. Like that's her life goal. That might be an exaggeration, but that's what it appears to be.
Is that it's one of the first websites that pops up when you type in dog bites. And this woman has put the time, money, and resources into creating a website that's number one goal is demonizing a specific breed of dog. Like, what?
Well, and she does when you look, especially on social media, I see this a lot, right? You see reports of pit bulls being the leading breed in fatal dog bites. They quote unquote kill the most people. And so
they do not bite the most people, though.
Yeah, but the lethality statistic is really what's highlighted, and that's really the driving force between a lot of this breed-specific legislation. And we'll talk a little bit more about the context of that particular statistic. But just to kind of summarize where we're at now, because we've been throwing around a lot of history and a lot of patterns. So there is a significant media bias towards pit bulls.
Mm-hmm.
And from that media bias, we get websites that draw information from those stories. And a third of the time, the media gets it wrong. And then, or close to about a third of the time. maybe a little bit more. And then these websites use that information that's wrong a third of the time to put out information about specific breeds, in this case, particularly the pit bulls. And then they draw these conclusions and make a generalization where all pit bulls are dangerous. Mm-hmm. And from those conclusions, from these websites and from the media, we get state legislators that put forth breed-specific legislation that usually, if not always, targets pit bulls. Mm-hmm. And that's a little bit concerning when you put all those pieces together, because it doesn't necessarily, you're not getting the accurate information that you would like, in theory, would like to have before you make a specific ban, which is what we see with a lot of these breed-specific legislations on a particular breed. We don't necessarily have that information.
It's not clear, right? So a lot of the times these legislations are reactionary legislations, like, oh, this is a problem, we fixed it like this, without any evidence to suggest that this is going to be a helpful thing.
Yeah, and I think we've kind of been hinting at whether or not breed-specific legislation works. We do have a very strong bias in this particular topic. We own a pit bull mastiff mix.
And we know a lot of pit bulls. My mom has one. My best friend has one. They're my nieces and nephews, and I love them.
Yeah, but let's put our bias aside from a second and just stay objective about whether or not breed-specific legislation actually works.
Right.
So the purpose of a breed-specific legislation is to reduce dog bites. I think most people can agree on that. The goal was to reduce dog bites. But does it actually work? Do dog bite rates go down? And the very short answer is no. There's actually evidence to support that. About 30 states have enacted some form of breed-specific legislation. And just about every single state where that's happened, what you'll end up seeing is that dog bites go down for a short period of time. And the reason for that can rather easily be explained. You're taking a lot of dogs, or you're either euthanizing them, you are people that are moving out of state. Mm-hmm. There's not as many dogs in the total dog population in that state for a period of time. Mm-hmm. And so it makes sense that dog bites would go down.
Right.
But it doesn't really go down by that much. It's very, very little and not that significant. But what you end up seeing is over time, over a 5-year, 10-year period, is that this rate of dog bites will go back up. And what we've ended up seeing is that in many of these states, dog bite rates have actually increased from where they were prior to the breed-specific mm-hmm. legislation. Now, that doesn't mean that breed-specific legislation all of a sudden means that it's causing more dog bites, but what it does mean is that it doesn't mitigate the problem of dog bites.
Yeah. However, the Canadian province of Calgary decided to try something different. Instead of explicitly banning breeds, they used a licensing enforcement program and dog safety education campaigns to teach people about how to properly care and raise their dogs. In stark contrast to the Toronto case, they saw a 500% decrease in dog bites.
Did we even mention the Toronto case? I don't think we did.
Oh, did we not?
So what she was referring to is that in the province of Toronto, mm-hmm. they put a very strict ban or breed-specific legislation. I don't think it was a complete ban, but it was. Actually, I think it was. So it was a ban on people purchasing pit bulls, but the people that already owned pit bulls were allowed to hold on to them, but they had to follow really strict rules. They had to muzzle their dog in public, keep them on a really short leash,
require them to be neutered,
et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And it got the public had a very negative perception of pit bulls, and that was very much media driven. And the Attorney General, Michael Bryant, at the time, even went as far as to say to reporters, I want to make sure I'm getting this quote right, says, "This is the beginning of the end of the reign of terror that pit bulls have wrought upon Ontarians for many, many years." Reign of terror, these really strong, loaded words.
It's a loaded sentence, for sure.
And what's just to kind of reiterate, what's so disturbing about this is that it wasn't supported by any kind of evidence. There wasn't mm-hmm. any research done to support that this particular form of policy would help mitigate a problem.
Right. It was reactionary.
Yeah.
So in contrast to that, the Canadian province of Calgary, like I said earlier, instead of banning specific breeds, started encouraging a license, or they did the licensing enforcement. So you have to register the dog that you have. And then they wanted to educate people about different kinds of breeds and how to care for them and how to raise them. And so they saw a 500% decrease in dog bites between 1986 and 2006. So what this tells me is that education and awareness works, whereas banning particular breeds does not. So when you make a point to educate people about how to care for and raise and respect big dogs like pit bulls, it encourages people to do just that. And it helps weed out a lot of these situations where, it's a dog that's chained up outside, that's not neutered, that's, scared and concerned for their safety, and then inevitably leading to them biting someone.
And that's another good point there is in many of the cases that, at least the ones that I've read, I ended up getting kind of sucked into some of these stories that were about, pit bulls like mauling kids or, hurting elderly people, or young women was another popular, I shouldn't say popular, but they were among the most prominent of the victims when it came to pit bull fatalities. And I was curious. And so I almost quite literally looked into each individual case and was like, what went on here?
Right.
And in most cases, it was very apparent that the dog was either neglected. This was the case in most of the elderly victims where the dog was neglected. They didn't take care of the dog. And then with the kids, dogs were left alone with them for extended period of time when they were young.
Infants, you should never leave any dog alone with an infant child. I don't care if it's a 5-pound dog or a 100-pound dog.
Yeah, when I say young, I'm referring to the dog itself. The dog was young.
The dog was young. Okay.
Yeah, so infants are obviously young. So the dogs were young as well.
Okay.
And they hadn't been trained or conditioned to act in or behave any kind of way.
They were new in the home, and the baby was new in the home, and there was a lot of stimuli happening that they weren't ready for.
Right.
And so the other thing that I would like to stress is neutering male dogs. That is one of the biggest deciding factors in a lot of these cases. Almost every single dog was unneutered in these fatality cases. And so we're not going to get into it, but that has to do with testosterone and some other biological things. But neuter your pets, man. Neuter your pets.
So given this information, why do you think breed-specific legislation is still a thing? Why do we still have it across 30 states?
I feel that it's reactionary, right? So these people see something tragic happen, and I think we both agree that when a dog, regardless of breed, kills someone, that's very tragic. But it's a reactionary type of legislation without taking into account any of the data or research that's been gathered from other BSL laws and, all of this dog research. Instead of going through the data and understanding it and approaching it in a way that's going to help reduce dog bites without harming people that already own pit bull type dogs, they're just like, oh, well, no more. Just get rid of them. Can't handle it.
Well, and for those who might be curious, if maybe the Center for Disease Control actually looked into this, maybe they the government actually did some research on dog bites.
Right.
What did they say? Well, they did. And it shouldn't be much of a surprise that when they came back with their recommendation, they recommended against breed-specific legislation.
Right.
And this was back in 2000. This was a while ago.
Yeah, so this was 18 years.
Well, what they ended up finding is that breed was not a very strong correlation between the prevalence of a dog bite. What they found is how you treat the dog, how the dog was trained when they were younger.
Right.
These are much more important factors when you're trying to predict whether or not a dog is going to bite you. And just to further take that, what they found in most of the cases of dog bite fatalities is that the behaviors, the problematic behaviors that are normally elicited from a dog that might be problematic were occurring far before the dog ended up hurting somebody.
Right.
And so what that suggests is that there was a great degree of neglect on the owner's side or the people taking care of the dog.
Right. Well, and kind of to add a more positive note, unfortunately, yes, the media has latched on to this archetype that pit bulls are dangerous and they attack children and they're untrustworthy. But we are also seeing big pushes for the positive pity, if you will. So while your news outlet, your evening news is not covering positive pit bull stories, it's almost always exclusively negative. Social media and that sort of reporting does cover a lot of stories where pit bulls have saved children from different instances. There's a whole, you can Google it, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories where pit bull type dogs, just like any dogs, have done something heroic or wonderful or been loving or had a bunny best friend.
Yeah. When I was, looking into this particular topic, I was reading stories about, pit bulls taking gunshots for their owners and pulling their owners out of fires. And these stories were, when you actually, look for the specific positive stories, were far more prominent than the negative ones, which is interesting because it seems like in more cases, especially in service animal cases where there's plenty of pit bulls that fill that role, there's a lot more positive stories about pit bulls out there. But the ones that hit the mainstream media are almost entirely negative,
right? And
focus on very gruesome stories. I was reading, there was a recent story about a pit bull attacking a woman on the subway, and I think it was one of these bigger cities. It could have been New York. I think it might have been New York.
Right.
And the media, immediately got hold of it, declared it a pit bull, and showed this, video of the pit bull, grabbing onto her arm. And you didn't get the full context of the story because when you looked into it a little bit further, the woman had pushed the dog first, and the dog was a service animal, and grabbed onto her arm.
Well, one of the reasons pit bulls make such great service animals is one of their traits is they are fiercely loyal to their owners. So they do whatever they need to do to feel like they are protecting their owners. And it does take work to train them and teach them, this is okay, this is not okay. I understand that you're trying to protect me, but this behavior is okay, this behavior is not okay.
Yeah, and it might be worthwhile for a minute because when I was looking into this, I was drawing some parallels in my head of it sounds familiar. Where have I heard this kind of pattern before? Particularly when it comes to media trying, I don't want to say driving a false narrative, but in the sense of taking a small part of the context around a much more complex issue and sticking with that and driving that home and really using strongly loaded words and rhetoric. And what ends up happening is that there's legislation that follows those mainstream media news stories.
Well, they create these ports that are incredibly emotionally charged, right?
Yeah, and immediately, what came to my head was, oh my God, this is exactly what happened with the federal banning of marijuana to some extent.
Right.
And now, of course, these are two completely different.
But the idea is that something came out that said this thing was bad without really any evidence or backing, or maybe a sliver of evidence.
It was a perception.
Right.
It looked bad, therefore it must be bad.
Right.
And lo and behold, marijuana becomes banned. Lo and behold, breed-specific legislation.
Well, and of course, Reefer Madness came out, and that basically taught everyone that this is a bad thing, and then no evidence to support that claim.
Yeah, and it just happens so often. And so regardless if you have maybe a personal bias or a personal attachment to this particular topic, I would encourage you guys to kind of look at this as an example of how a negative perception can be exacerbated and create an irrational fear of a certain thing, or in this case, an animal,
right?
And how that can lead to policies that are often poorly orchestrated,
right,
and in many cases costly. In the case of breed-specific legislation, it ended up causing thousands upon thousands of pit bulls to be euthanized unjustly.
Well, yeah, and it's tragic because obviously I think about my dog, and if they had made some kind of legislation that said, oh, well, he has to be euthanized now, I'd be like, well, you're going to have to fight me. So...
Or we would move to another state.
Or we would move, yeah. So I can't imagine having my dog taken away from me because someone else decided that my dog was dangerous. especially if, your dog has never done anything to suggest that they're aggressive or dangerous, regardless of breed.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just, I feel like this is a wonderful example of why we need more research and science and that kind of backing into the policies and legislations that we make on any topic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just think this is a great example of that. But the good news for pit bull lovers out there is that there are several organizations pushing back against breed-specific legislation,
Right.
using this evidence and the supporting science to say, well, it doesn't really work.
Mm-hmm.
All that really changes that when you put it in, implement breed-specific legislation is which breed is causing the dog bites.
Right.
Hospitalizations don't go down. Fatalities don't really go down that much. It doesn't work on paper.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a solution that does work, and that's a lot of what these organizations are putting out. And so the American Bar Association, for example, the American Veterinary Medical Association,
Mm-hmm.
which we mentioned recently, the Humane Society of the United States, the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the CDC. In addition to that, that's most of these organizations, when they go to talk to policymakers, reference the CDC study saying that, look, that even the federal government, had came out and said, look, these dogs, the breed itself is not what's causing the prevalence of dog bites. It's a lack of awareness and education around how to take care of dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And they're having great success with it, and hopefully they'll continue their mission, and hopefully we'll see some of this breed-specific legislation hopefully turn into more educational campaigns.
Right, education-based, understanding that regardless of breed, dogs are animals. And because of the way that we have slowly turned wolves into the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dogs breeds that we have, they're still animals. They still have needs. They still get scared, and they still get concerned for their safety if their needs are not met. So it's about understanding the needs of your dog, making sure that the needs of your dog are met, and then having a dog that's appropriate to you and your lifestyle, right? If you're someone who's not prepared to handle and train a 100-pound dog, don't get a 100-pound dog.
For those people that might be interested in pit bulls or considering buying one, what are maybe some tips that you can give them? How to start training them?
Yeah, so I got Diesel 5 years ago. It was before we met, and I wasn't working at the time. I was between semesters in college, and it was very much for me about overstimulating him constantly at a young age. So I took him to Oktoberfest and trade shows and the farmers market, anywhere that would allow me to bring him, I would take him. So he was constantly being overwhelmed by sights and sounds and smells and people and touch. And so that really helped me get him to a state where he was not a reactionary dog at all. He just kind of, he's cool with everything. Nothing really bothers him other than when we come in here and he's out there. He does not like that.
Socializing the dog.
Socializing is super important, and consistency. You can't just, they know this trick now. They know it forever. No, do it over and over again. Do it every day or every week once they get it, and make sure that you continually use the same commands that they've learned, and that I know it's easy to get lazy with dog training, but just being consistent and then understanding, what your dog wants. And if they're hyperactive, then maybe they need to burn their energy. Maybe they need to go on a run or go play and fetch,
Well, to the note about playing, this is a very important point made by a lot of these advocacy groups,
mm-hmm.
The ones trying to push back against breed-specific legislation, is the idea of play biting.
Mm.
This was a point that they was pretty consistently made across the board, was that playing with your dog and being okay with them, like biting your hand. Like I do this with puppies all the time. I'm a terrible example of this. Heck, I still play bite with Diesel, and he's 100 pounds. But when the dogs are really young, it's an important to not permit the behavior of them biting your hand,
nipping,
and that being a form of playing. Because when the dog gets older, and of course when they, their mouths get bigger, their jaws become stronger, that play biting can end up hurting somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I would have to say any two big takeaways would be avoid the play biting and socialize your dog. Socializing your dog is probably the
number one.
Yeah, number one.
Socialize your dog. Socialize.
That's probably the most sure way to make sure that your dog is not going to be aggressive or towards
other people, other dogs, other animals. Socialize the hell out of your dog, and that will reduce a lot of the problems.
And that's probably one of the sources of most of the problems that we've seen is when pit bulls specifically have not been socialized.
Right.
So there's a story recently too. Unfortunately, I had to read a bunch of these. It was real depressing. But it's just what pops up when you look up this information. There was a dog that had broke into like a child after school.
It had gotten out of its pen and jumped the fence into after school.
It jumped the fence into a daycare and was chasing the kids. And so the immediate reaction was pit bull attacks kids. Well, that wasn't technically accurate.
Right.
Because when you look at this pit bull, he was running around nibbling the kids on their butts.
Yeah, he wasn't trying to hurt them. He was
play biting.
Yeah, he was nipping them because he was trying to play with them.
Yeah, he was very excited, overstimulated, and probably not hadn't been socialized and didn't know how to behave in those circumstances. Mm-hmm. So he got real excited. And of course, when it hit the media, right, pit bull, goes on rampage against kids or, some stuff like that, where it's not contextually accurate and it paints a really bleak image where it's not necessary. But yeah, is there any last notes that you want to talk about before we wrap this up?
No, I just think to summarize, again, it's so important to do your research and to understand a topic before you have an opinion on it. And so like pit bulls, I see this all the time with my job. People are constantly posting about how dangerous they are. And it's like, well, some are, because they were raised wrong and they were treated improperly and they were probably scared and they attacked someone. And some pit bulls kill people. So do other dogs. So just having an understanding.
Yeah, and I think if we're going to look into making any kind of policies around dogs in general to try and prevent dog bites, I think it's really important that we get it right.
Yep.
And for those of you, this is an interesting little fact for you guys. If you look at Pew Research did an article about this. They were looking at what percentage of Americans view their cat and their dog as being part of their family. Dogs won out. I think it was 85 to 90% of Americans who own a dog view them as being part of their family.
Yeah.
And so regardless of
especially whether or not, millennials.
Yeah, and so regardless of you're one of those people that are like, oh, dog, these people that view their dogs as their children are ridiculous, whatever it may be, right? Because we hear that all the time because we talk to our dog like he's our child all the time.
His mom got mad at us because we call our dog our kid.
Yeah. But understanding whether or not you hold that perspective, most people view their dogs as being very precious and a part of their family. So regardless if you think it's appropriate, that's just the reality of how people look at their dogs.
That's their reality.
And so when we pass breed-specific legislation, let's look at it as if we were treating members of family. Mm-hmm. That might not seem like a rational comparison, but that's how people view it, and so that's how we need to view it going forward if we're going to look at dog-specific legislation.
And what do you guys think we missed? What do you think we should have included? What are your guys' thoughts on BSL? What do you guys think about pit bulls? Please try not to be too negative. We're not trying to
be constructive.
Be constructive. That's all we ask. Be constructive. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I will stop punching my mic eventually, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
And all the links that are pertinent to the information that we discussed in this podcast will be down below.
Down below, like always. Bye.
Have a good one.